The early fall afternoon of 2008 in Eugene, Oregon, began with an inexplicable stir around the Gateway Mall area, where several store employees noticed a few unmarked patrol cars quietly pulling up near the bus stop behind the mall. People peered through coffee shop windows as officers in tactical jackets fanned out, checking every narrow walkway leading down to the dark parking lot, while across town, the Turner family tried to stay calm, repeatedly calling friends and neighbors in hopes someone had seen Mia on her way home. As her phone kept ringing unanswered, an icy chill spread through every family member, a feeling that something had slipped off the normal track of life. At the scene, police took a statement from a passenger who said they had seen Mia standing alone under the dim yellow light near the bus stop. Then just a minute later, she vanished, as if she had never been there. An eerie silence blanketed the area, as though the darkness was hiding something they couldn't yet see. Mia's mother, her hands trembling slightly, still clutched a strand of her daughter's hair that had clung to the jacket she was wearing when she signed the missing person report. An image many officers would never forget. The internal radio crackled at 9:47 p.m. Search team is ready. Starting in the residential areas, expanding toward the open lots. None of them knew that moment. An evening that seemed peaceful in Oregon would kick off an investigation stretching more than a decade, leading them through riverside trails, dusty case files, scattered clues, and finally revealing a truth no one dared imagine. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Fall 2008. Eugene, Oregon was wrapped in the chill of late day and the yellow glow spilling from deserted bus stops. Rows of trees along the parking lot swayed gently in the wind, while the Gateway Mall behind Mia Turner still blazed with light and noise, voices and music drifting through the glass doors. But the moment Mia stepped away from that area, the familiar sounds were quickly swallowed by the cold, dark quiet of an early autumn evening. Mia Turner, 15, had just said goodbye to her friends after a weekend hangout. Wearing her backpack and gripping the strap of her jacket, she walked the path that led to the bus stop behind the mall. It was a route she had taken countless times, quick, safe, and well lit enough for parents to feel okay about it. But that night, with the darkness thicker than usual, and a cold wind threading through the trees, that familiar path carried an unusually heavy silence. A passenger standing a few yards from the bus stop remembered catching a glimpse of Mia. She was standing alone, seeming both like she was waiting and like she was watching something in the nearby shadows. Nothing strange, just the sight of a teenager catching a late bus, something that happened all the time around here. When the bus rolled past, the passenger no longer saw Mia. They just assumed she had changed her mind and walked off in another direction. But from that moment on, every trace of Mia completely vanished. When the clock passed the time she was normally home, the family started to worry. Texts went unanswered, call after call rang out and then went silent. The living room lights stayed on, dinner grew cold on the table, and the parents' fear kept growing. Mia had never come home late without letting someone know. She had never gone hours with her phone turned off. The family decided to search on their own first. They drove the streets she usually took, circled back to the mall, asked security guards and nearby employees. No one had seen Mia leave the mall in a different direction, and there was no sign she had stopped at a friend's house or a nearby store. The neighborhood was as quiet as any other weekend night, but that quiet only made them more afraid. When they reached the bus stop behind Gateway Mall, the scene felt even more unsettling. The parking lot was almost empty, with only the sound of wind whistling past the tall streetlight. No matter how many dark corners they checked or how many times they called her name, they found no sign that Mia had ever left the area safely. Everything seemed to stop right there at that last spot where light and shadow met, the last place Mia was seen. As the night wore on, the hope that Mia was just late slowly turned into clear fear. The complete lack of contact made the family realize they couldn't wait any longer. In desperation, Mia's parents called the Eugene Police Department to report that their daughter was missing. When the Turner family's missing person call came into the duty desk, the night shift officer immediately wrote down every detail with the urgency typical of cases involving minors. The mother's anxious voice came through loud and clear, enough to tell him this was not just a kid staying out too late. After confirming the basic information, he entered the data into the system and alerted the missing persons unit, setting in motion the first steps to reconstruct Mia's final movements before she vanished. Using the initial information provided by the family, police started building a timeline of Mia's movements beginning the moment she left Gateway Mall. Mall security was asked to pull all surveillance footage from afternoon through evening. The video files were organized by location so investigators could cross-reference them. Footage of Mia splitting off from her friends and heading toward the side exit became the first visually confirmed times. Based on her steady pace and normal behavior, police noted that she left the mall voluntarily and showed no signs of being forced. While reviewing CCTV, investigators also canvassed for witnesses in the area. Security guards, employees near the exit, and random shoppers were interviewed. A few remembered seeing Mia cross the parking lot, but no one saw her talking to strangers or appearing to be in any trouble. The scattered statements were pieced together to confirm that Mia had safely left the mall and headed toward her usual bus. Next, police tracked down anyone who had been at the bus stop around the last confirmed sighting of Mia. The witness, the one who had come forward the night before, was interviewed again in greater detail. They confirmed seeing Mia standing near the stop, seeming like she was either waiting or lost in thought. However, no one saw her board any bus. Checking bus routes and interviewing drivers on duty during that window turned up the same result. No one remembered picking up a girl matching Mia's description. This led police to officially mark the bus stop and the walkway behind the parking lot as the last reliable point, the final place Mia was seen according to both witness statements and camera footage. Along with building the timeline from video and witness accounts, police needed to understand Mia's personal context to determine whether she might have had any reason to disappear voluntarily. Working with the Turner family, they collected recent schedules, emotional state, school relationships, travel habits, and any unusual changes in routine. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Mia had no major problems, no signs of being threatened, no plans to run away, and no secret meetings with strangers. Her friends also turned over phones and messages for analysis. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. Mia's social media accounts and communication history were scrubbed to rule out grooming or online predation. Messages from right before the disappearance were mostly about school and friends, her own age. There was no indication she was secretly meeting anyone or engaging in anything outside her normal routine. When all the information was stitched together, police had a consistent picture. Mia left the mall normally, walked toward her usual bus stop, was confirmed present there by a witness, but never boarded any bus. She vanished immediately after that window. No contact, no clues, no trace. The timeline was complete, and the last reliable point was firmly established. The paper phase of the investigation closed, setting the stage for the next step, when police would have to face the biggest question: where did Mia go after that moment, and what happened to her in the darkness behind that bus stop? Almost immediately after the timeline was finished and the last reliable point where Mia was seen was confirmed, the physical ground search was launched. The area around the bus stop behind Gateway Mall, along with every nearby residential street she might have walked, was prioritized first. This was a stable residential zone with flat roads, easy access, and decent foot traffic, so police hoped there might still be initial traces if Mia had simply left the area in distress or gotten turned around. The search team was divided into small groups of police officers, community volunteers, and some mall security personnel. They started at the bus stop itself, the last place Mia was seen, and expanded outward in widening circle. Each group was tasked with combing dark corners, the backs of buildings along the parking lot, empty lots, and the small footpaths that wound through the neighborhood. Those paths were commonly used by locals as shortcuts between the shopping area and the houses behind it, so police thought Mia might have taken one if she decided not to wait for the bus. Following standard procedure, teams logged every object, mark or anything suspicious to hand over to the evidence unit. But every street corner, every bush, and every small yard along the routes Mia might have taken yielded nothing helpful. Items they picked up, candy wrappers, an old glove, bits of windblown trash, were quickly ruled unrelated to Mia. Even a broken phone found near a dumpster was confirmed to belong to a local resident, not Mia. One volunteer group was specifically assigned to check the shortcuts behind older buildings, where streetlights were dim and visibility was poor. Those spots sometimes served as temporary shelter for homeless people, or anyone trying to get out of the wind. But aside from a few pieces of cardboard and abandoned plastic bags, there was no sign Mia had ever passed through or been held there. A few residents who lived right by the bus stop were visited in person because they could see the area daily from their window. Every one of them gave the same answer: nothing unusual, no screams, no one who looked like Mia walking past after the witness saw her. This reinforced the idea that if something happened to Mia in this zone, it either happened incredibly fast, or she never left the area on foot the usual way. Police also thoroughly checked the secondary parking lots, hidden behind the row of stores, places with weak lighting, limited cameras and little evening traffic. Teams looked in every gap between parked cars, behind dumpsters, along privacy walls, and any other blind spot. But after hours of searching, they found no personal items, or anything that could be linked to Mia being there after she left the bus stop. When the first day ended, the entire surrounding residential area, every trail and every open space around the bus stop, had been searched exhaustively. The teams returned to the staging area tired and frustrated. Every effort led to the same conclusion: there was no evidence Mia had left the area in any verifiable direction. And more importantly, there was no sign she had even crossed into the zones the search had already covered. After compiling all the field reports, police officially ruled out the residential neighborhood and the immediate bus stop surroundings as useful search areas. That didn't bring them any closer to Mia's location, but it played a critical role in narrowing the investigation. These negative results showed that if Mia did leave the last place she was seen, she did not travel along familiar paths or residential streets. At the same time, it forced investigators to start considering more complicated and unpredictable possibilities. Possibilities that would require expanding the search beyond the city's well-lit, accessible roads. The failure to find any trace of Mia in the residential areas and around the bus stop forced police to redirect the search. After re-examining the entire map, they realized there was only one area close enough to the last reliable sighting that had not yet been checked: the strip of land running along the Willamette River, where the terrain was dense, poorly lit, and almost completely cut off from regular foot traffic. This was not a logical route for a 15-year-old girl walking home, but with every other area already ruled out, the riverbank became the next target, even though the chances of finding any leads remained extremely slim. From the very first steps into the Riverside woods, the search teams noticed a stark difference from the residential neighborhoods they had covered before. There were no more flat sidewalks, no streetlights, no familiar paths. Instead, thick overgrown bushes, wet ground, and the cold air carrying the smell of mud and decaying leaves. The narrow trail down to the river was both slippery and steep, making movement far more difficult. Natural sounds: running water, branches snapping underfoot, wind through the leaves, made the atmosphere heavy, exactly the feeling everyone was trying not to dwell on. The search team was divided into 3 groups, each responsible for a long consecutive section of the riverbank. This time the equipment included probes for searching under leaf litter, high-powered flashlights, and evidence logging kits. Given the dense terrain and numerous blind spots, police ordered every step to be taken with extreme care to avoid damaging or stepping on any potential traces beneath the mud and soil. They were no longer looking for large items or clear footprints like in residential areas, but focusing on even the tiniest details: scraps of fabric, scratch marks, foreign objects, slide marks, or patches of disturbed earth. About an hour after starting, one group discovered a small piece of fabric caught on a low thorn branch. Its color immediately caught the team's attention because it matched the tones Mia had been wearing on the day she vanished. However, after logging, packaging, and sending it for expedited analysis, the lab could not yet confirm whether it was connected to Mia. It could simply be fabric from someone else's clothing who had passed through the area early. Though it provided no answers, that small scrap was still retained as the first potential piece of evidence. Another group, searching right along the water's edge, found several small indentations in the soft mud. The shapes, however, were too faint to determine whether they were human shoe prints or just animal tracks. Combined with some scratches in the loose soil nearby, police had to admit that the riverbank terrain made it nearly impossible to distinguish abnormal human movement from natural effects of water and wildlife. Still, every suspicious spot was documented, flagged, and added to the scene map for later comparison. The deeper the search pushed into the Riverside Strip, the heavier the pressure became on the rescue team. It wasn't just the increasingly difficult terrain, it was also the eerie relative silence of the area. Each group had to constantly check one another's positions via radio to avoid becoming too spread out in the tangled landscape. Time was another source of stress. Natural light was fading fast, forcing them to race to finish the search area before full darkness fell. No matter how powerful their flashlights were, they couldn't illuminate every nook and cranny in this dense riverside forest. A few other objects were found scattered here and there: an empty soda can, a broken piece of plastic, a length of nylon cord, but investigators quickly determined they were most likely trash, carried by the current or wind. Still, per standard procedure, everything was collected for further analysis in case an unseen connection existed. With each verification, however, hope of finding anything linked to Mia continued to fade. By the end of the day, the entire stretch of riverbank within the radius Mia could plausibly have reached had been thoroughly searched. None of Mia's personal belongings, no phone, no backpack, no jewelry, no dropped clothing, turned up in any form. Although a few suspicious items were logged, nothing was clear enough to draw conclusions. The complex terrain caused natural and intentional traces to blend together, leaving investigators almost unable to distinguish one from the other. At the close of the second day of searching, the summary report stated, the Willamette Riverbank area had been fully covered, but yielded no significant leads. Although the possibility that Mia had passed through could not be completely ruled out, police had no choice but to temporarily close this search direction and move on to the next steps in the investigation. Steps no one on the team wanted to contemplate, yet ones they were forced to take as every trace seemed to be slowly vanishing into the darkness along Oregon's riverbank. After 2 days of searches that turned up no clear signs in either the residential areas or the riverbank strip, pressure was crushing both the investigation team and the Turner family. Then, on the early morning of the third day, while mist still cloaked the trails around the Riverside Park, the call everyone dreaded finally came. A jogger who regularly ran along the path near the Willamette River reported finding a female body lying next to an old concrete wall on the edge of Owen Rose Garden. The caller's voice was shaking, but clear enough for police to understand this was an emergency and very likely directly related to Mia's disappearance. The location where the body was found was more secluded than the riverbank sections the teams had searched the previous day. The concrete wall, a remnant of a long-abandoned structure, was hidden behind thick bushes and rarely visited. Reaching it required walking down a narrow leaf-covered trail that had nearly disappeared under vegetation. Even the jogger had only spotted the body by chance when he veered off his usual route to avoid a puddle and noticed an unusual color beneath a low bush. When police arrived, the area was immediately sealed off. Even without entering the scene deeply, from a safe distance, they could see the body belonged to a very young female. The clothing on the victim nearly perfectly matched the description of what Mia was wearing the night she vanished. A light-colored t-shirt, dark jeans, and her familiar sneaker. Everything lined up so precisely that mistaken identity seemed impossible. Yet no officer rushed to a conclusion until formal identification was complete. What immediately alarmed investigators, however, was the absence of several personal items Mia was known to carry. The gray backpack, the jacket witnesses remembered her clutching, and other items listed by the family. None were present at the scene. This absence multiplied the dread, because it indicated Mia's presence here was not accidental and was completely at odds with her normal route. Even without detailed analysis, investigators understood that a teenager had no reason to come alone to such a dark, isolated spot far from the bus stop, and outside any path she normally took. The initial forensic team approached the body with utmost caution. They documented position, angle, and distance from the concrete wall, but did not dig into details or touch anything to preserve the scene. These initial recordings were solely to ensure accurate information for later analysis. The surrounding area was marked off, isolated from outsiders, and every object within reach was noted, even without immediate assessment of its value. Meanwhile, command continuously coordinated with investigators to connect the time of the body's discovery to Mia's previous timeline. The fact that the body was not far from the bus stop yet in a completely separate and hard-to-reach area raised a major question. How and why had Mia ended up there? Police could not answer anything yet, but everyone understood that the appearance of a body showing initial signs matching Mia effectively ended any hope of finding her alive. The news was quickly relayed to the Turner family. None of them were mentally prepared for this, even after 2 sleepless nights and growing dread. Being told a body had been found near the search area was enough to shatter whatever hope remained. The family was asked to come assist with preliminary identification, a cruel task no parent ever wants to face. While the forensic team continued preserving the scene, other officers prepared paperwork to shift the case from missing person to homicide investigation. This was a critical transition that completely changed the scope and handling of the case. The moment the body was discovered marked the end of the hopeful phase and the beginning of a far heavier, more complex chapter. Though no official confirmation had been made yet, the entire investigation team knew the journey ahead would no longer be about searching for a missing girl, but about tracing the evidence of a crime committed in the darkness along the Willamette River. The discovery of the body required police to immediately seal off the entire area around the concrete wall, now considered the center of the crime scene. As soon as the tape went up, the forensic unit began initial surveys to fully document the original state of the area, before any evidence risked being disturbed. From the body's position to every surrounding bush, everything was cordoned, numbered, and photographed from multiple angles to guarantee authenticity in later analysis. A few meters in front of the body, investigators discovered faint drag marks on the ground. Because the soil near the riverbank is usually damp, soft, and easily disturbed, the marks were no longer sharp, but clear enough to show that a heavy object, very possibly a human body, had been dragged across the dirt before coming to rest where it was found. The direction of the drag marks indicated the victim may have been moved from the narrow trail leading into the area and then placed or pulled right up to the wall. This led police to suspect the discovery site might not be where the entire attack took place. Around the drag area, a few scattered footprints also appeared in the damp soil. None were clear enough to determine size or detailed tread pattern, but investigators still carefully measured and framed each one. Since the riverbank often sees joggers, walkers, or fishermen, it was impossible to say yet whether these prints belonged to the perpetrator or someone who had simply passed through earlier. Still, their presence close to the body placed them on the list of physical evidence requiring analysis. Beyond the ground traces, a small object lying near a bush, a few steps from the body, drew attention. It was a piece of dark nylon cord, apparently dropped or torn, with slight fraying at one end. Though its origin or connection to the victim could not yet be determined, the technical team collected it according to protocol, sealed it in an evidence bag, and made notes for later clarification. Small items like this can sometimes be crucial pieces in reconstructing the perpetrator's actions, so nothing could be overlooked, no matter how minor. While ground traces and foreign objects were collected, another group of technicians approached the body cautiously to observe without altering position. The soil and leaf litter around it were examined for signs of a struggle or resistance. Though no immediate conclusions could be drawn, the state of the clothing and body position reinforced the initial assessment that the victim had been attacked suddenly, with no time or ability to escape. This became even clearer when technicians noted material under the victim's fingernails, a very small amount of biological sample, but enough to suggest Mia may have tried to fight back in her final moment. During collection, technicians used specialized kits to retrieve biological samples from under the victim's fingernails. The samples were carefully separated, placed in preservation tubes, and immediately transported to the lab under strict seal. This was a critical procedure because fingernail scrapings often contain the attacker's DNA, if the victim scratched or grabbed the perpetrator while resisting. Though the visible amount was tiny, with 208 technology, it was still valuable for analysis. The crime scene team also noted an anomaly. There were no signs of a weapon anywhere near the body, no knife blade, no metal object, no cutting marks or sharp surfaces left behind. This suggested the perpetrator either carried the weapon on their person or deliberately removed it from the scene after the crime. The absence of a weapon was a significant clue, both complicating the investigation and indenting the attacker's level of preparation and control. Once the entire area had been surveyed, photographed, and sampled, the investigation team drafted the initial report. Though no official conclusions were made, the physical evidence at the scene combined with signs on the body showed this was not an accident or random disappearance. Every detail pointed to a sudden purposeful attack carried out by someone who had managed to control the scene well. The crime scene along the Willamette River, with its faint drag marks, scattered footprints, and unidentified objects, became the starting point of a highly complex pursuit of the truth. But at that moment, all the investigation team had were fragmented clues, small, vague, and insufficient to paint a full picture of what had happened to Mia Turner in her final hours. The next steps would force them to wait for the lab to analyze the biological samples, one of the few clearly valuable leads in an otherwise extremely murky situation. Immediately after the crime scene was secured and the body was removed from the banks of the Willamette River, the autopsy was conducted at the Lane County Medical Examiner's office. This was the most critical step in determining the cause of death, time of death, and any direct traces that could reveal characteristics of the perpetrator. When Mia Turner's body was brought into the examination room, the forensic team had prepared records, crime scene photographs, and the preliminary report for cross-referencing throughout the procedure. The initial findings were unmistakable. Mia died from multiple fatal stab wounds, all indicative of a frenzied and uncontrolled attack. The injuries were concentrated on the upper body, showing that the perpetrator attacked while completely overpowering the victim and giving her no effective opportunity to defend herself. In addition to the stab wounds, Mia's body showed clear signs of fierce resistance, such as scratches on her hands, forearms, and several other areas directly related to attempts to protect herself from the blows. Some wounds varied in shape and depth, suggesting the perpetrator either used varying force or attacked in a state of loss of control. Detailed analysis of wound placement also revealed that Mia fought back desperately, resulting in chaos during the assault, but she was physically unable to escape the attacker due to the overwhelming difference in strength. The most crucial discovery during the autopsy came from biological samples collected from beneath the victim's fingernails. While struggling, Mia had left the perpetrator's DNA behind by scratching or grabbing any part of his body she could reach. Under the microscope, technicians clearly identified tiny epidermal cells and skin fragments trapped under the nails. The samples were carefully removed, sealed according to protocol, and sent to the lab for analysis. The DNA results quickly confirmed that the material belonged to an adult male, who was not any relative of Mia's, and did not match anyone known to have been in close contact with her on the day she disappeared. This was the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case up to that point, a direct, undeniable, physical link between Mia and her killer at the moment of the attack. Once the DNA profile was complete, it was entered into the CADIS National Criminal Database for comparison. The result came back completely negative. The man's DNA did not match any previously recorded criminal profile. No prior arrests, no biometric records in the system, and no connection to anyone previously detained or investigated. The absence of a database match forced the investigation in a far more difficult direction. The perpetrator was most likely an ordinary member of the community, with no criminal history, no prior contact with law enforcement, and no previous trace in the system. This made narrowing the suspect pool exponentially harder, as investigators could not rely on criminal databases to shorten the list the way they could in similar cases. In the final report sent back to the lead investigative team, the medical examiners concluded that Mia had been attacked without warning and likely had no foreknowledge of the danger until the moment it occurred. The direction of the attack, the severity of the injuries, and the victim's defensive reactions all pointed to violent and determined behavior by the perpetrator. Yet the lack of any database hit left the entire case in unknown offender status, forcing police to pursue much more challenging investigative avenues. At the conclusion of the autopsy, police had gained one vital piece of evidence, but still nothing sufficient to identify the killer. They now possessed the attacker's DNA, but his identity remained a complete blank. And that blank became the greatest challenge, marking the beginning of the deeply stalled phase of the investigation that followed, when every clue pointed to a man who had never appeared in any law enforcement record. The conclusions from the medical examiner's office increased the pressure on the investigative team, and as in most homicide cases involving a juvenile victim, the first name they had to clear was the person closest to Mia, her boyfriend, 16-year-old Evan Mercer. As soon as the autopsy report reached the office, Detective Keller immediately ordered Evan brought in for an initial formal interview. Evan was the last person known to have seen Mia in a private setting before she appeared at the mall that afternoon. The two had been dating for less than 4 months, a typical high school relationship, not particularly serious, but serious enough for Evan's name to top every internal police discussion list. When summoned to the station, Evan arrived with his mother, a resolute woman who tried to remain calm as she watched officers spread files across the table. In the first interview, Evan was cooperative. He recounted meeting Mia at lunch at school, then walking together to the gate after classes before each heading home separately. He insisted there had been no argument and nothing unusual about Mia that afternoon. However, his behavior, occasionally glancing down at the table or looking to his mother as if seeking approval, led Detective Keller to note signs of unexplained stress. To verify Evan's statement, police immediately obtained his phone records, call logs, texts, and network connection time. The technical unit's report showed that during the window when Mia disappeared, Evan's phone was mostly connected to home Wi-Fi with social media activity, but no contact with Mia after 6:00 p.m. However, a roughly 30-minute gap in connectivity from 7 was flagged by Detective Keller as a period of interest. Parallel to the phone analysis, police retraced Evan's personal timeline through classmates and his homeroom teacher. A few students said Evan seemed anxious on the last day Mia was seen alive, but the descriptions were vague and possibly influenced by the chaotic atmosphere at school after news of her death spread. Witnesses confirmed Evan did not leave the school area before dismissal and showed no hostility toward Mia in prior weeks. When police returned for a second interview, they focused on the connectivity gap. Evan explained he had left his room to walk in the backyard without his phone, a habit when he felt stressed, usually after major tests. His mother corroborated this, stating Evan often isolated himself from his phone when he wanted quiet. Though the explanation partially accounted for the gap, police still found it insufficiently convincing, especially given that the victim was his girlfriend. The next step was a full background check on Evan. School records showed no history of violence, no recorded conflicts with Mia, and no behavioral issues. One teacher described him as a nice, somewhat quiet kid, but absolutely not someone with problems. Evan's family also had no recent upheavals that might have affected him psychologically. After 3 interview sessions and 2 rounds of data verification, the team found no direct evidence linking Evan to the crime scene or the time of the attack. The DNA recovered from beneath Mia's fingernails did not match. There were no physical signs Evan had been in a violent struggle with her that day. Clothing, shoes, fingernails, and phone were all examined. No blood, no scratches, no unusual cleaning trace. Ultimately, in the case review meeting, Detective Keller concluded that although Evan had a few inconsistencies in his statement, they were insufficient to designate him a primary suspect. Some behaviors were simply the psychological reactions of a teenager suddenly thrust into the center of a serious criminal investigation. The investigation shifted direction, Evan was cleared of suspicion, and the team was forced to continue searching for the killer without any clearer lead. But that decision brought no relief. Instead, it opened a terrifying void. If not Evan, then who had killed Mia in a city long considered peaceful? Clearing Evan forced the team to return to their original approach. Community witnesses. This is always one of the most difficult aspects of any missing person turned homicide case, and Mia Turner's was no exception. Within hours of the official announcement of Mia's death, the Eugene Police Department hotline began receiving dozens of calls, each person offering a different version of what they saw that night. From the start, Detective Keller and his subordinates knew that in a community-shocking case like this, the volume of noise would far exceed genuinely valuable information. What they did not anticipate was how contradictory the statements would be, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct any reliable picture of the perpetrator. The first witness reported seeing a man in a black baseball cap standing near the bus stop shortly before Mia was believed to have been there. But when pressed for details, she could not describe his face, height, or build, only vaguely recalling that he kept looking around like he was waiting for someone. This was the kind of description police logged but could not treat as a solid lead. A second witness told a completely different story. A silver SUV parked illegally in the lot near the trail behind the mall, remaining there too long with no one getting out. When asked for the license plate, he didn't remember. When asked for the make, he wasn't sure. When asked for exact time, he had no idea because it was cold. I just glanced and kept walking. Subsequent statements only complicated matters further. A college student said he saw a couple arguing loudly near the trail, but when shown photos for confirmation, he denied it was Mia or anyone connected. An elderly woman claimed she saw a girl in a red jacket running panicked along the sidewalk, yet Mia was not wearing red that night. The youngest witness, a high school boy who lived near the bus stop, initially said he saw a man dragging something like a large bag toward the eastern lot. But when police returned for a follow-up, he admitted he wasn't sure his parents wanted him involved. and the original statement might have been confused with another day. The constant contradictions meant the team could not construct a reliable timeline of activity in the area the night Mia disappeared. Despite the large number of witnesses, no two accounts matched, and some directly contradicted each other. One said the man was white, another insisted black. Some said the perpetrator was on foot, others swore it was a small truck. One witness claimed the area was completely silent, another recalled hearing screams, but couldn't remember the time. Detective Keller paid special attention to multiple reports of a stranger hanging around the mall in the week before the disappearance. Yet when witnesses described the man, police ended up with 3 completely different composite sketches, with no meaningful common features for alert or suspect profile. Even security footage from nearby stores yielded nothing useful. Mia was clearly visible on CCTV entering the mall, but once she exited toward the bus stop, no cameras covered that area. Attempts to match people in the footage with witness descriptions failed. Those who appeared on video didn't match descriptions, and those who matched descriptions didn't appear in the relevant time frame. Worse, some callers provided only rumors or second-hand stories, information impossible to verify. Detective Keller issued an internal reminder: "We must separate valuable information from the fog of collective imagination." But the deeper they went, the thicker the fog became. When all statements were summarized in the second-week review meeting, the only point the team could agree on was the potential witness file grew by dozens of pages yet advanced the case not 1 inch. All the collected data resembled shattered glass, each fragment reflecting a different, incompatible image. Once again the investigation fell into complete deadlock. No suspect, no reliable witness, no clear direction. The only remaining harsh truth was that the killer had acted in the darkness of an ordinary night without a single person seeing him. After weeks of canvassing witnesses and analyzing every piece of accessible data, the investigation team returned to their desks, with essentially nothing. No new leads surfaced, no single detail strong enough to open a different avenue. All they had at this point was the killer's DNA, a silent identifier that refused to connect to any real person in the world. As soon as the DNA profile was completed, police uploaded it to CADIS, hoping for the first real break. The result came back ice cold: no match, no criminal record, no prior arrests, no biometric data from anyone ever in the system. They knew the killer through the microscopic cells trapped under Mia's fingernails, yet the national database had never heard of him. That almost certainly meant the perpetrator had never been flagged before, at least not in any way the U.S. justice system could recognize. Running parallel to the DNA dead end, crime scene technicians confirmed there was no trace of a weapon. That alone made it nearly impossible to learn anything further about the killer's method or habits. No knife, no blunt object, no instrument of injury left behind or discarded nearby. The team searched the area in ever-widening radii, including patches of ground where small items could be hidden, yet the weapon was never recovered. The most likely explanation was that the killer brought everything with him and took everything away. Zero physical trace, an action that spoke of determination and an unusually high level of scene control. Other evidence collected at the scene, shoe prints, drag marks, scuff marks, was meticulously analyzed but yielded nothing more useful. No clear fingerprints to run. The shoe prints were smudged and lacked enough detail to trace brand or exact size. The drag marks only confirmed the body had been moved from one spot to the final location. They offered no additional direction. Every piece of evidence felt like a faint echo from the scene, too weak to push the investigation forward. Police also widened their net by reviewing traffic camera footage, cell phone pings, and license plate readers, for anyone who passed through the area the day Mia vanished. But large sections along the Willamette River had no CCTV coverage, and most locals drove personal vehicles without passing tolls, so no electronic data helped narrow suspects. The task force meeting at the start of the second month was one of the quietest since the case began. Every detective brought thick files, yet no one had a single new page. The final report simply read, "No new investigative leads developed in the past 14 days. Detective Keller felt the pressure from the victim's family, from the community, and from within himself. A 15-year-old girl murdered in the heart of Eugene, a city long considered safe, placed an enormous weight on the department, yet no clue would unlock. They had exhausted every standard approach, every path led to a brick wall. They tried expanding the behavioral analysis, but there was too little data to build a meaningful profile. They re-examined the area's unsolved cases for similar patterns, but nothing prior matched Mia's killing. Every line of inquiry pointed to something more frightening. The killer could be someone from the community, yet no one knew who he was because he had never shown dangerous signs before. As weeks turned into months, the number of officers assigned full-time dwindled, media pressure. Though the case remained officially prioritized, it began to take on the shape of a future cold case. One where every existing piece of evidence had been wrung dry, and then like an old clock running out of ticks, the investigation slowed and nearly stopped. No new direction, no new clue, no breakthrough. All that remained was Mia's body, an unidentified DNA profile, and the unanswered question. Who killed Mia Turner, and how did he vanish without a trace in the middle of a busy city like Eugene? When the active investigation effectively ground to a halt, Mia Turner's file was temporarily placed among unsolved cases, but it wasn't until 2010, 2 full years with no progress, that the Eugene Police Department transferred the entire file to the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit in Salem. The move was largely administrative, yet heavy with meaning. The case was no longer a top-tier priority for frontline investigators. The day the file was shipped out, Detective Keller, who had been with the case from day one, wrote his final note. All currently available investigative methods have been exhausted. Requires better technology or new data in the future. It was a closing line no one wanted to write, but the honest assessment of the entire team at the time. At the Cold Case Unit in Salem, Mia's case was not assigned to a large team. Instead, a young investigator named Mark Halden, recently transferred to the unit, was given the task of periodic review. That was the polite term for checking the file only when time allowed, or when new DNA-related technology became available. For Mark, it was both a challenge and a burden, an agonizing unsolved case with no answer. The Cold Case Unit occupied an old building with gray walls and rows of metal filing cabinets. Mia Turner's file sat in drawer 4B, slot 26, labeled with a yellowed piece of paper curling at the corners. Every time Mark opened the drawer he saw Mia's photo on the cover, a 15-year-old girl, with long hair and a still childlike smile. It was the clearest reminder that no matter how much time passed, no matter how deep the file was buried, a child had lost her life and no one had answered for it. Mark had no authority to reopen a full-scale investigation. His job was to re-examine every piece of evidence, every report, every stored DNA test, looking for changes in analytical standards or new technology that might apply. He read the old statements over and over, sometimes wondering if the original team had missed a tiny detail. Each time the conclusion was the same, nothing strong enough to expand the inquiry. Meanwhile, Mia's family, exhausted by years of waiting, continued to keep the case in the public eye. Her mother, Rebecca Turner, held small memorial gatherings every year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, usually in the park near the Willamette River. The events were never large, but a handful of familiar faces always showed up. Mia's old friends, neighbors, and occasionally local reporters. Rebecca also sent regular letters to the Cold Case Unit with any rumor or tip she heard, no matter how small. For her, the most important thing was making sure Mia's file was never forgotten. In a short interview with the Eugene Weekly, she once said, "If we stop speaking up, who will remember her? Who will remind the police that Mia is still waiting for justice?" Those letters were always added to the file, and Mark was the one who read them. Every letter from the Turner family was a raw reminder that the case was not just numbers, autopsy RPECs, and timelines. It was a family's unhealed pain. In that environment, the Cold Case Unit could only hope for two things: a sudden confession from someone, or a revolutionary leap in DNA technology, neither of which anyone could count on. And though Mark Halden never said it out loud, he knew the odds of solving the case at that point were frighteningly low. Yet no matter how many years passed, no matter how completely frozen the case appeared, Mia's file was never classified as no longer viable for review. The unit had an unwritten rule: every cold case would be reopened at least once a year. And every time, Mark would pull open the drawer, take out the faded folder and read through every page, hoping to see something his predecessors had missed. But until that day, through the summer of 2010, and for many years after, Mia Turner's case remained a silent stack of paper, waiting for the world to change. No new leads, no new witnesses, no technology strong enough to break through the fog hiding the killer. The case officially entered its frozen stage, and it looked like it would stay in that cabinet forever. Nearly 8 years after Mia Turner's file was shelved in the cold case drawers, A major shift in forensic science began reaching investigation units across the United States. Early in, the Oregon Cold Case Unit received an internal memo from the Oregon State Crime Lab. A new generation of DNA analysis technology had been officially rolled out, capable of separating extremely old, extremely tiny, and especially mixed biological samples, including DNA mixed with the victim's own. When the news reached the unit, investigator Mark Halden practically jumped out of his chair. What detectives in 2008 had labeled unresolvable due to contamination could now be cleanly separated using next-generation sequencing, NGS, the most advanced DNA analysis method available at the time. NGS could peel apart thousands of genetic markers instead of the handful used by traditional STR profiling. For cases like Mia's, where the killer's DNA under the fingernails was drowned in the victim's own genetic material, this was game-changing. It meant the perpetrator's DNA was no longer buried inside Mia's. Mark immediately requested permission to resubmit the evidence sealed for the past 10 years to the lab in Salem. When the evidence box was opened, forensic technicians worked in a strictly controlled environment to prevent new contamination. The microscopic cells scraped from beneath Mia's fingernails were separated, placed in reactors, and run through the new sequencing machine. Results did not come quickly. Mark waited weeks, trying to keep his expectations realistic. He knew many cases nationwide had tried NGS without success. But one summer morning, an urgent email from the lab arrived, and he knew the case had finally taken a breath. The report was nearly 40 pages long, but one short paragraph on page 3 made him read it over and over. The separated DNA sample belongs to a male individual, showing genealogical overlap with a rare family branch present in public genealogy database. This was something traditional DNA technology could never do. It did not directly identify the person, but it identified the family tree, unlocking an entire digitized pedigree. It meant that even though the man who left DNA under Mia's fingernails had never appeared in any criminal database, distant relatives of his might have uploaded their DNA to public sites like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. With that information, the lab recommended contacting genetic genealogy experts, specialists who could build family trees from hundreds of DNA profiles and narrow the list to the most likely individual. Mark immediately forwarded the full report to the district attorney's office and requested collaboration with well-known genealogists, including some who had helped crack high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer. This scientific breakthrough was more than just a technical step forward. It was like unlocking a door that had been sealed for a decade. For the first time since 2008, Mia Turner's case was moving again. No longer dusty pages in drawer 4B. No longer a frozen case living only in a grieving family's memory. From a tiny DNA sample once considered useless, investigators finally had a new path. A family branch, a genetic structure, a lead strong enough to point toward the real identity of the person who murdered Mia Turner. The last chance, and the first real chance in nearly a decade, had arrived. Less than a week after the new DNA report was sent in, Oregon's genetic genealogy analysis team officially took over the Mia Turner case file. When Detective Mark Halden transferred all the data to this specialist group, he knew this was the decisive phase, the stage where science and data analysis would do what police had been unable to for 10 full years. From the very first working session, the genealogy experts uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, two open-source forensic platforms that allow comparison against millions of users who have voluntarily shared their genetic data. The goal was not to find an exact match, but to locate people who shared portions of DNA, distant relatives who might overlap by just a few percent. The results showed more than 100 potential matches at varying degrees, from fourth cousins to shared ancestors more than a century back. This was the first step, and the most complex one. The team began building family trees from these matches, determining each person's relationship based on the percentage of shared DNA. A genealogical map gradually took shape. Large family branches stretching across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of California. To narrow the list, the analysts immediately applied the first filter. Only branches with male members of the right age range in 2008, from 18 to roughly 45, were kept. This eliminated dozens of branches right away because they had no one in that age group or only females. The second filter came next, cross-referencing each family branch's place of residence in 2008. This was time-consuming, requiring census data, local records, early social media information, and even old birth and marriage certificates. Many initially promising branches were discarded once it was clear they had lived permanently in completely unrelated states. With each applied criterion, the family tree shrank. From more than 100 initial matches, the team narrowed it down to about 40 potential individuals, from 40 to 12. Finally, by comparing secondary DNA markers, such as paternal haplogroups, they were left with 4 men from the same rare Pacific Northwest lineage. At this point, the experts started combining the DNA data with behavioral and social context. They examined each of the remaining 4 individuals, residence history, employment, travel patterns, age, and most importantly, the possibility of being in Eugene, Oregon in 3 were eliminated almost immediately. 1 was serving in the military overseas throughout. 1 lived in Spokane, Washington, with medical records proving he was essentially unable to travel far at the time. The 3rd worked full-time in a small southern Idaho town and had 0 connection to Oregon. Only 1 name met every single condition: Victor Alvarez, 33 years old in 2008, living in Springfield, just across the Willamette River, less than 3 miles from where Mia disappeared. Victor belonged to the exact lineage suggested by the DNA analysis and was the only person in that line living near Eugene when the crime occurred. Employment records also showed he worked freelance with no fixed schedule, a factor that fit the behavioral pattern of many opportunistic offenders. When the genealogy team presented these findings to Mark Halden, they emphasized genetically the probability that Victor Alvarez is the person who left DNA under Mia Turner's fingernails is greater than 9. In genetic genealogy, that is as close to absolute certainty as it gets. There was no second name, no alternate candidate, no remaining branch left to check. For the first time since 2008, the Mia Turner case had a name, a real living person who existed in residence records, appeared in social data, and had been right there in the community when the murder happened. Genealogy had fulfilled its mission. It had narrowed an entire forest of data down to 1 single man. And from that moment, the file was no longer a frozen cold case. It was pulsing again with the rhythm of a real investigation. But the surveillance and confirmation of Victor Alvarez would begin in the next section. Immediately after the genealogy analysis team concluded that Victor Alvarez was the only individual left in the entire family tree who could be connected to the crime, Detective Mark Halden understood that the next phase was no longer just paperwork. This was when police had to leave the desks and return to fieldwork for the first time since Mark and his team began pulling every accessible record on Victor. They reviewed 20 years of residence history, cross-checked when he appeared in Springfield, examined address change documents, vehicle registrations, insurance records, and employment history. The first thing that stood out was that Victor never stayed anywhere long. In 2008 he lived in a short-term rental apartment in Springfield. Before that, Salem. Afterward he moved to Cottage Grove, then Roseburg within a few years. People who constantly relocate aren't rare, but they always fall into the persons of interest category in murder investigation. Victor's work history was equally unstable. He did freelance labor for auto shops, took car repair jobs, sometimes worked as a day laborer, then quit whenever he felt like it. No fixed workplace, no one keeping track of his schedule. That didn't prove anything by itself, but to investigators, it uncomfortably matched the unusual mobility pattern seen in many opportunistic offenders. With residence records in hand, Mark moved to the most critical part, matching Victor's movements. This was the piece the original team had never been able to touch a decade earlier. Using archived documents, Mark found proof that Victor had registered an old Ford Ranger pickup in Springfield in the summer of 2000. Even more telling, insurance records showed the truck had been serviced at a garage less than 2 miles from the mall where Mia vanished. No one could prove Victor was driving that night, but the geographic links were tightening the circle. Mark kept digging into financial transactions, phone bills, anything that might create a travel trail. Results were murky, but one detail stood out: Victor frequently turned his phone off, sometimes for days at a time. That made electronic tracking nearly impossible, while simultaneously revealing a habit of avoiding digital traces. After compiling the file, Mark and the assigned detectives planned direct surveillance. At that time, Victor was living on the outskirts of Eugene, still in the same area he had occupied in 2008, a coincidence too big to ignore. His home was a rented room in an old wooden house next to the forest, where neighbors barely spoke and paid no attention to each other. In the first days of surveillance, Victor kept a low profile. He left the house at irregular hours, some days heading to work in the morning, other days not appearing until nearly noon. He often stopped at auto parts stores and occasionally did odd jobs for a local garage. The most striking thing was that he was always alone. No friends, no relatives, no significant relationship. To the detectives, that kind of isolation was more worrying than any overt strange behavior, because it reflected someone detached from the community long enough that no one really knew who he was. The surveillance team spent more than 2 weeks watching his every move. They logged daily routes, stores he visited, the times he typically left and returned. The goal wasn't immediate arrest. It was to collect an indirect DNA sample, a legal requirement, before requesting search or arrest warrants. Obtaining indirect DNA required absolute patience. They needed an item Victor had touched and discarded, uncontaminated by anyone else. The first opportunity came when Victor bought takeout coffee at a small shop. He finished it, tossed the paper cup into a nearby trash can. An undercover agent, posing as a passerby, grabbed the cup before sanitation arrived, sealed it, and sent it to the lab. Result: unusable. The sample was contaminated by store employees. Undeterred, the team waited for the next chance. The second time, Victor flicked a still wet cigarette butt onto the concrete in a supermarket parking lot. Another agent retrieved it immediately and preserved it carefully. The lab reported the DNA had degraded from moisture and dirt. On day 19 of surveillance, the third chance arrived. Victor ate lunch at a diner and left the table without taking the used napkin. One of the detectives grabbed it the moment he walked out. This sample was cleaner, sealed in an evidence box, and rushed for priority testing. While awaiting results, Mark kept gathering every tiny piece of information to confirm Victor could have been near Mia's disappearance site, and Victor's freelance work records from that year showed many gaps with no activity, perfect windows for someone to move around unnoticed. When everything was laid out on the table, Mark knew they were approaching one of the most pivotal moments in this decade-plus case. Only one piece was still missing: the test result from the napkin DNA. And when the call from the lab finally came, Mark knew everything was about to move into a new chapter. But that result, and the dramatic turn it would bring the entire case, would be revealed in the next section. The call from the lab came late one afternoon, while Mark Halden was reviewing the previous day's surveillance notes. The technician's voice on the other end couldn't hide his urgency. The first sentence Mark heard made the entire room seem to freeze for a moment. The DNA on the napkin is an exact match with the sample recovered from under victim Mia Turner's fingernails. No ambiguity, no margin of error, no request for a retest. The lab confirmed. Mark stood silent for several seconds, as if his brain needed time to process the information. 10 years since Mia was murdered, and at last they had what every investigator dreams of: direct, irrefutable evidence. The crucial part wasn't just the match itself, but that the napkin sample belonged to Victor Alvarez, collected indirectly, fully legal, uncontaminated, and gathered without procedural violation. This was the key piece needed to justify search warrants, an arrest warrant, and a full reopening of his 2008 activities. Mark wrote down every word from the lab report. The DNA profile obtained is an exact match, with no possibility of random match in non-relative population. That meant, unless someone was a close blood relative of the perpetrator, no one else on Earth could have this profile. And Victor Alvarez had no twin brother or close male relatives in the area. That same evening, Mark called an emergency meeting with the cold case unit and prosecutors. Every document related to Victor was laid out on the table: residence history, travel records, time living in Springfield, unstable employment, vehicle registration timing, habit of turning off his phone, and now, a perfect DNA match. The prosecutors reviewed every piece of evidence to ensure the conclusion wasn't based on assumptions or guesswork. They double-checked the indirect DNA collection procedure, confirming the detective followed regulations, and the lab adhered to strict standards. Result: 0 error. One prosecutor whispered, "This case is practically textbook. We can move immediately." Mark opened his laptop and began drafting the arrest warrant application, page by page. The centerpiece was the genetic genealogy process, a complex section but extremely persuasive in court when backed by solid evidence. He explained how the genealogy team identified the lineage, narrowed hundreds of people down to one name, then added field surveillance, behavioral red flags, and finally the DNA proof that Victor was the person who left traces under Mia's nail. Mark also attached a psychological profile provided by a consulting expert, describing the perpetrator as an opportunistic offender with no social ties, frequent moves, isolated lifestyle, and travel history matching the crime area. Every piece of evidence was pinned to a clear timeline. 2008, Victor lived 3 miles from the scene. 2018, DNA reanalyzed with new technology. 2020, genealogy confirmed the lineage. 2022, surveillance and indirect DNA collection. The file became a tightly woven chain with no gaps. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Victor Alvarez was the man who killed Mia Turner. When the document was finished, Mark printed the final version and took it to the on-duty judge's office in Eugene. The judge read every page, occasionally frowning at the complexity of the genetic techniques, but the more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a vague accusation, it was a chain of heavy legal evidence converging from technology, behavior and hard data. Finally, after nearly an hour, the judge signed the last page: arrest warrant for Victor Alvarez, officially in effect. Mark walked out of the courthouse gripping the file as if it carried the entire 10-year weight of the Turner family. He didn't call with the news right away. He stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, taking a deep breath to stay calm, because he knew, tomorrow, everything would change, and in the next section, that change would arrive in the form of a takedown the entire Eugene community would never forget. Early the next morning, the moment the arrest warrant took effect, an emergency meeting was convened at the Eugene Police Department. Lead investigator Mark Halden presented the final operational plan. Victor Alvarez was not a fleeing suspect, or someone with a prior violent record, but he lived quietly, unpredictably, and had almost no social interaction. Factors that made law enforcement unable to underestimate his potential danger. The prosecutor's office demanded the arrest be executed flawlessly, with no chance for Alvarez to escape or destroy evidence at his residence. The Oregon SWAT team was mobilized alongside Eugene patrol units. This wasn't a large-scale operation like a drug raid or gang sweep, but the extraordinary context, a case that had dragged on for over a decade, made everyone understand that every move this morning would be written into Oregon judicial history. At 5:40, the convoy silently rolled without sirens down the dirt road leading to the rental where Alvarez lived. A row of old wooden houses on the edge of the forest, isolated from any neighborhood. Dawn light was still dim, thick fog cloaking the area in an eerie veil, as if covered by cold glass. The SWAT team leader signaled for silence. Each member moved exactly into the positions assigned the night before. Mark Halden stood behind the main formation, close enough to witness everything but not interfere with tactics. This was the moment he had chased for years. His heartbeat quickened as the entry team began the procedure. At the first command, the loudspeaker blared. "Victor Alvarez, this is the Oregon State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door immediately." Silent, no sound from inside, no footsteps, no furniture moving. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The SWAT commander glanced at Mark for confirmation per protocol. Mark nodded. Breach. The first ram shattered the hinges. The door collapsed inward. SWAT flooded in, clearing each room in seconds. An agent shouted, "Suspect located." Victor Alvarez was standing in the kitchen, still holding a glass of water, as if he had just been yanked out of his own thoughts. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring blankly at the tactical team aiming flashlights and weapons at him. An officer yelled, "Get on your knees, hands on your head." Victor complied without a word, without any visible emotion. As the cold metal cuffs locked around his wrists, Mark stepped inside and silently watched. For 10 years the named perpetrator had existed only as a ghost in files. Now that ghost stood in the flesh right in front of him. As Victor was escorted outside, the first rays of morning sun pierced through the pines. The few neighbors in the area, awakened by the noise, watched from a distance in confusion. One woman exclaimed, What did he do? What's going on?" No one answered. They had no idea the quiet man who lived there was the suspect in one of Eugene's most tragic cases. As the convoy transporting Victor left the wooden houses, the Oregon State Police media team, already briefed, began preparing the official statement. The Mia Turner case was already infamous locally. It had haunted the community for a decade, and every development spread like wildfire. Just hours after Alvarez was brought into the interrogation room, the feeble announcement was made at a press conference at police headquarters. Reporters from Eugene, Portland, Salem, and even regional networks poured in. Cameras focused on the podium, waiting for the moment Oregon finally touched the resolution of the case everyone thought would never be solved. Major Randall Owens opened with a sentence that made the room hold its breath. Today, the Oregon State Police officially confirmed the arrest of the suspect in the 2008 murder of Mia Turner. Victor Alvarez's name was stated clearly. His photo, a middle-aged man with a hard, cold face and emotionless eyes, appeared on the screen behind. The room buzzed. Many reporters covered their mouths in shock. Some who had covered the case back in 2008 couldn't hold back tears. The news spread across Oregon in minutes. The killer in the decade-plus-old case has been caught. Social media exploded. Old posts and photos of Mia were reshared by residents. Local forums wouldn't stop discussing it. From Eugene to Portland, everyone asked the same question. He lived among us all these years. Outside in the afternoon sunlight, Rebecca Turner, Mia's mother, wept when police informed her before the press conference. Inside the station, Victor Alvarez sat silently in the interrogation room, hands cuffed, face revealing nothing. A 10-year journey ended in a moment Oregon would never forget. The arrest of Victor Alvarez instantly thrust the Mia Turner case back into the center of Oregon's justice system. Within weeks of his detention pending trial, the Lane County District Attorney's Office completed the formal indictment, a hundreds of pages document compiling the entire 14-year investigation. When the trial opened, the courtroom was packed with media, the victim's family, and residents who had followed the case for years. In her opening statement, prosecutor Laura McKenna laid out the chain of evidence in a tight, logical sequence considered exemplary among cold cases. She began by recalling the 2008 context, when Mia disappeared, then walked the jury through every investigative phase, from the Willamette River scene, the DNA under the victim's fingernails, to the years of deadlock before next-generation DNA technology and genetic genealogy emerged. McKenna presented each piece in perfect chronological order, leaving nothing out: how NGS separated the perpetrator's DNA from the mixed sample, how the genealogy team narrowed hundreds of suspects down to a single family line, how investigator Mark Halden tailed Victor Alvarez and collected discarded tissue DNA, and finally, the lab report confirming a perfect match between Victor's DNA and the DNA found under Mia's fingernails. She emphasized, there is no longer any possibility of random coincidence. There is no room left for doubt. When the prosecutor displayed the DNA match probability slide, the jury went silent. The number on screen, 1 in billions, said everything. In DNA cases, that level is tantamount to identity confirmation. Alvarez's defense attorney Daniel Price tried to attack the validity of the discarded tissue collection, arguing it could have been contaminated or did not prove his client's state of mind on the day of the murder. But the prosecutor immediately countered with complete lab records. The sample was collected to standard, uncontaminated, and sealed from collection to analysis. Price kept pressing that genetic genealogy was merely inferential, not direct evidence. McKenna countered that genealogy wasn't used to convict. It only pointed to the real person. Victor's own DNA sample, not the family tree, was the final key tying him to the crime. On the third day of trial, the prosecution called the DNA technician who ran the. He explained how modern technology separated mixed DNA segments, something impossible with 2008 systems. His testimony hit the jury hard, proving science had overcome the limits that once froze the case. When it was Victor Alvarez's turn to speak, he said only a few sentences, denying involvement and claiming it must be a system error. But that weak denial carried no weight against days of evidence. In her closing argument, prosecutor McKenna delivered a line that silenced the courtroom. Mia Turner fought until her very last second, and in that desperate moment, she left behind the DNA of the man who killed her. That DNA led us here today to speak for. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with grave faces. The foreperson stood, holding the signed verdict form. We find the defendant Victor Alvarez guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted into layers of emotion. Some sobbed. Others sat frozen. Rebecca Turner clutched her son's hand, eyes red but resolute, as if after 14 years, the truth had finally spoken. The judge imposed the maximum sentence, life imprisonment without parole. Victor Alvarez showed no reaction, only bowed his head, eyes as empty as the day he was arrested. As officers led him away, no one stood, but everyone knew the final door of the case had closed. Justice, though late, had finally been served. For the Turner family, that moment closed a 14-year agony, but also opened emotions too complex to name. After the trial, Rebecca Turner stood before cameras, voice trembling yet clear. "My daughter isn't coming back, but at least now she has been heard. Justice came late, but it came." She said every passing year had been a fight to keep Mia's file from being forgotten. And when the killer finally stood trial, it wasn't just victory for her family, but for every family whose missing child still had no answer. Mia's brother, now an adult, added, "We lived more than a decade with a wound that wouldn't close. Today we can start to heal." Oregon's communities reacted powerfully. Mia's case had once symbolized helplessness, a safe city where a 15-year-old girl could be murdered without a single link. But when the case was cracked using next-generation DNA and genetic genealogy, residents of Eugene, Springfield, and the entire Willamette Valley reshared the story as proof. Science can bring justice back, no matter how much time has passed. Local universities, especially the University of Oregon, held seminars on forensic genealogy, using the Mia Turner case as the textbook example. Molecular biology professors called it an irreversible turning point in modern criminal investigation. The talks drew packed rooms of students, many hearing for the first time that a few cells worth of DNA could unlock a case thought buried forever. Beyond academia, the Oregon State Police added the Mia Turner investigation to the official cold case training curriculum statewide. Investigator Mark Howden, who had carried the file for nearly a decade, was invited to lecture on coordinating DNA tech, NGS separation, and genealogy analysis. Trainees relived every phase, from the moment the mixed sample was successfully separated, to collecting Victor's discarded tissue. The training focused not just on success, but on lasting lessons: how to preserve evidence with relentless care, the importance of technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred, and keeping a case alive through years of deadlock. Dozens of pre-2010 unsolved cases in Oregon and neighboring states were reopened to see if old biological samples qualified for new analysis. Some were revived, and people began calling it the Mia Turner effect. On a broader level, though the trial ended, the case's legacy kept spreading. Victim advocacy organizations cited it as proof of the need to fund DNA research and upgrade state labs. Several Oregon politicians began pushing budgets to expand forensic genealogy statewide, a tool once dismissed as secondary. And when media finally closed their last reports on the trial, what lingered in the community wasn't the face of the perpetrator, but the new power of science and the unbreakable will of those who pursue justice. They understood that without next-gen DNA, without meticulously preserved evidence, without the Turners' refusal to let the case fade, Mia's file could have stayed forever in a cold case cabinet. Today, when people speak of Mia Turner, they remember not only one family's pain, but a milestone in the modernization of criminal investigation. The case proved that time can blur traces, but science, when given the chance, can pull light back. And that is the greatest legacy the Mia Turner case left Oregon. The story of the Mia Turner case is not just the journey of solving a 14-year-old cold case. It reflects many issues still present in American life today: community safety, the power of forensic science, the role of vigilance, and the value of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. In the story, Mia was simply a 15-year-old girl walking home from the mall, an ordinary activity that happens every day in Eugene and thousands of other American cities. Yet that ordinary moment became a deadly blind spot. Mia leaving her friends at Gateway Mall and walking through a dimly lit area reveals a reality: everyday situations, without awareness, can turn dangerous. It is a reminder to American families and communities that personal safety must always come first. Walk with friends after dark, share your location when moving, or simply stay aware of your surroundings. Another major lesson comes from the investigation's long deadlock. Despite police searching everything from neighborhoods to the Willamette River banks, every early lead hit a wall. This reflects the reality that many U.S. law enforcement agencies still face limits in technology, budget, and manpower. But the 2018 breakthrough, when next-gen DNA and genealogy opened entirely new paths, proved that science doesn't just advance, it can resurrect justice. It is a clear call. Funding forensics, expanding databases, and specialized training are essential to protect modern American communities. Finally, the Turner family's perseverance is a profound moral lesson. They never let Mia's story be forgotten, and that persistence kept the case alive in both public memory and police files. In a fast-moving American society where pain can easily be left behind, this story reminds us that justice sometimes takes time, but it should never be abandoned. Thank you for following the journey to find justice for Mia Turner. If this story touched you, please subscribe to join us for the next cases. See you in the next video, where we continue shining light on mysteries and giving voice to victims who deserve to be heard.